Well, hello again. This time I'll be going into some more detail on the actual research I was doing and some of the findings that I came up with my North Mekeo informants and others. So it might be a little bit more technical than some of the discussion that we've been having till now. From the start of my field studies, it was clear that the culture and social organization had changed considerably following European colonial imposition. And of course, that was one of the things I was there to study. But as my work with Kaiba and others progressed, I came to realize that any explanation of those changes depended upon a solid grasp of the nature of the system before the changes had ensued. So, how could I make sense of any change without knowing what it was that it had changed from? So, this became a central principle in all of my later research on change, here and elsewhere. So, as I continued to record information relevant to social change, Kaiba and I concentrated actually on reconstructing the parameters of the culture and social organization that preceded it. The three questions regarding North Mekeo death feasts preoccupied us. It seemed like everything else of the culture hinged on them and how we came to understand what was going on there. First, why were the patriarchy of the deceased, the owners, ceremonially giving away sacred heaps of mortuary feast foods when it was they who were most closely related to the deceased? I knew from Malinowski that in the Trobrians, it was the matrilineally related kin who hosted their funeral feasts, owners, if you will. But one was patrilineal, one was matrilineal. Why the difference? Second, why was it that those sacred foods that must be eaten only by members of other clans? Those are mainly the laborers who do the actual work of collecting the raw foods in the first place. And third, what was the rationale behind the arrangement that the two village clans exchange mortuary feasts reciprocally? In his two Mekeo publications, Hawilfa provided a lot of detail about death feasts, but he gave no hint as to answering those questions really. It turned out that the staple foods which Mekeo normally eat, when they get incorporated in the heaps of mortuary feast food laid out there in the village grounds, they're regarded as dirty and potentially deadly if eaten by the feast owners, the patrilineal kin of the deceased. At the same time, those very same sacred foods that the laborers eat at feasts are clean and life-giving to them in ways beyond their mere nutrition. One day towards the end of my fieldwork, I prepared a list of what we had concluded so far. It led to a new explanation. After walking Kaiba through those steps, I ventured, so the feast foods must represent the body of the deceased. And he immediately explained, of course. Under close examination, it turned out that the different foods given out at death feasts stood for gifts that the deceased in his or her lifetime had been given by members of other clans. So by giving back representations or substitutions for those prior gifts, the owners were kind of expunging their own clan body of the previous donations that had come from outside, donations that they no longer needed. Simultaneously, the laborers and people of other clans who received these foods were reincorporating into their clan beings and their bodies and so on what they had earlier lost. So why did they have to do that? Well, again, North Mekeo clans marry exogenously. If two clans do that generation after generation, the bloods and components of clan relationship would become progressively dilute. Less and less of the blood of a person comes strictly from the father. So that creates a problem. If everybody becomes related to everybody else by duplicated blood ties so that the integrity of every clan becomes compromised, almost to the point of meaningless. Only 1/16 of your blood is from your father directly. Thus, mortuary feasts deconceive the deceased, as I termed it, deconceive. That way, the deceased survivors who belong to different clans become non relatives and eligible to afterwards marry and mix the essences of the two clans again. So, as a simple good example, think of a person as an egg with two ingredients. There's four, but let's just talk about two: the white and the egg, the egg yolk. During procreation and amidst all other lifelong exchanges between kin, the yolk and the white are mixed up together in every person, all right, without distinction. But North Mekeo feasts simply unscramble the yolk and the white, preparing the survivors for orderly rescrambling marriages in the future. Now, chieftainship is absolutely central to this. The four categories of chief and sorcerer priests for each clan are known as Akaija men. They're viewed as patrilineal descendants and heirs to the mythical creator god Akaija, who gave the Mekeo and Rora people their traditions. The powers possessed by Akaija men are basically magical or ritual powers. It's Akaija men, and only they, who are empowered by their pedigree and their magic to convert ordinary staple foods into sacred feast foods, who can do this deconceptive work. And it is only they who can exchange them at mortuary celebrations or feasts of their own inauguration to accomplish deconception. In subsequent discussions, I will be looking at additional ways both Mekeo and Trovian chieftainship and magic shed new ethnographic light on political organization and hierarchy further across the Austronesian world. So keep that example in mind. My family and I said our tearful goodbyes to our relatives by mid-1976. We spent the next 4 years at Minneapolis while I continued analyzing my field data and writing up the results. Fortunately, my veiled structuralism provided the necessary tools. I switched to Steve Gudeman as a supervisor, and soon after I got into my material, it became apparent that all the contexts of the culture that I was dealing with were underpinned by villagers' complex understanding of bodily processes or metaphorical extensions of them. Early in my fieldwork, for example, being a native Californian, I was puzzled by people's obsessing over the cleanliness of the bare village grounds. I observed at dawn, women mostly, would collect the litter scoop it up, that had accumulated in the area surrounding their homes since the previous morning. With bush knives and scoops, they would also scrape the ground to shave off the stubbles of kunai grass just popping up above the surface. Next, they would scoop those and other droppings in the village's open central area. Those waifs included the shit of pigs, dogs, chickens, and toddlers. Then women would deftly pick up those little waste piles and carry them to the edge of the village and toss them into the bush, just beyond the village border, the perimeter. Now, that central space of the village where they gathered the stuff was called the village inaina. It means womb, belly, or abdomen. It was also obvious, too, during that same morning hour, when people would casually drop what they're doing, stroll out of the village into the bush, and return 5 or 10 minutes later, guess what? So something similar and important was obviously going on between people's bodies and the world at large. And there was more to it. As I mentioned last time, men gather each morning on the clubhouse to be fed overheated leftovers from the previous night's meal, and women would eat it with their children at home. Afterwards, everyone attended to the customary activities that are regarded as supportive of village life, work of various kinds. Mostly that involved securing the raw bush materials necessary for people's projects for the gardens, from the forest, from the rivers, and so on. So garden food, game, animals and fish, water, firewood, building materials, herbs for healing and magic, and so on. They got it during the day. In the late afternoon, everyone returned to their homes carrying those resources, standing on high pilings, lined up on houses on high pilings lined up facing one another across the empty village abdomen. From there, people went about converting the raw materials they had procured into the goods that they were aiming to use. They chopped firewood, they built houses, they carved canoes, they cooked food, they shared it out, and so on. Well, those activities, of course, generate all kinds of useless byproducts or waste that fall to the ground. Now think about it. Everything that villages were doing was done with one another of four global partitions and times of the 24-hour day. Two belong to the village and two to the bush. First of all, the village is a primarily human space, which the surrounding uninhabited bush is not. The bush, consisting of tall forest, is mostly a covered space. Hence, it is regarded as inside. You're inside it. It supplies the raw materials necessary for the village. The forest gives it up. The bush gives it up. Being uncovered, though, the village is regarded as an outside space. So when you walk from village to bush, you go inside. Coming back to the village, you come out, you come outside. But in accord with the daily routine I just described, the outside village has an inside part, the abdomen, and the inside bush has an outside part, say, the zone around the village where waifs are dumped and accumulated. So basically, the outside village and the inside bush are bisected, each with both an inside and outside parts. And people and things circulate regularly between them, going in and going out. So what I discovered was the activities taking place with the world at large, village and bush, were homologous with the vital processes of human bodily life. The inside of a human body is clearly differentiated from the outside, say, by the skin. But bodily life is dependent upon things from outside coming in, like food, say, and it also requires things from the inside going out, like piss, shit, sweat, breath, sexual fluids, and so on. So the body, too, consists of four primal zones, just like the world at large. Moreover, human bodies have four basic modes of existing and interacting with one another that are coordinated with the differences of gender. There are basically two kinds of people. In the first instance, male and female. Women's bodies, in view of menstruation, lactation, and giving birth, are relatively open compared to men, say. And because men's bodies don't do those things, they are at least relatively closed. But there are times when women have to concentrate on closing their bodies, like after giving birth and after menstruating. And normally closed men concentrate on opening their bodies, like when they eat lots of food, excrete lots of shit, and copulate with women. So basically, men and women switch between opening and closing their bodies seasonally and in coordination with one another. Now, the details are very complex, but it is in those terms that women interact with each other. For my dissertation, I termed this recurring fourfold pattern a quadripartite structure, which is the title of the book when it was published. Now, according to a lot of classical anthropological theory, many traditional cultures consist of two-part or are based on two-part or binary structures. Whatever one half seemed to be, the other half was its categorical opposite. The key puzzle was that such systems, on close observation, were not always strictly binary. Sometimes A was not the absolute opposite of B, or the difference between them was ambiguous or contradictory. Well, the quadrite structures of Bush Mekeo culture provided a new solution to that puzzle. The dualities Hawofa had identified and others had consistently reported turned out to amounting to four clans, four kinds of chiefly leaders of each clan, two proper chiefs supported by two official sorcerers, four patrilineal branches to each clan led by one or the other of the chiefs or sorcerers, and so on. It was enormously complex but consistent. After my supervisor, Gudeman, read the first draft of the thesis, we met to discuss it. He seemed to like it very much. Somehow, I mentioned in passing, well, all that inverting and folding back of oppositions upon themselves recurred much the same way across contexts. But I told him I feared it would be an extra lot of work to demonstrate that abstractly. I'd have to go back through everything and do it as a formula of some kind. Well, maybe I should have kept quiet because the structuralist in him thought it would be worth doing. Unfortunately, I already knew, once I said that, where I might be guided in doing so. As part of my graduate school infatuation with structuralism, I grew cautiously interested in Lévi-Strauss's novel methods. He was a giant in anthropology at the period from France, kind of a national treasure there. His so-called canonical formula for the study of myth caught my attention. He claimed that because myths are restricted by nothing other than the human mind, they revealed something essential about the nature, the logic of pure human thought. And guess what? His formula itself is and can clearly be seen as quadripartite. And from my perspective, I could see how the oppositions of his formula were bisected pretty much in the same way that they were bisected in North Mekeo culture. There were differences of terminology that I won't go into, but there was one that was critical. He used his formula to compare myths, but only myths across different cultures. There wasn't much emphasis on how the myths of one culture connected with the rest of that culture, the non-myth parts. And that is what I was finding, bisected dualities in many separate contexts, internal to Bush Mekeo or North Mekeo culture, as well as myth. So I dedicated the fourth year of my thesis writing to the formalization of all my North Mekeo non-mythical ethnography in terms of that modified version of Lévi-Strauss's formula. Well, the thesis was examined and passed in August 1980, just before I was to take up a tenure track appointment at Hartwick College in upstate New York. Of course, I wanted to find a publisher, but I had no time to organize that. Hartwick was a strongly focused undergraduate teaching institution, so I had to hit the ground running. I had to prepare from scratch 7 lecture courses that first year. And the only one I had under my belt was the Intro to Cultural Anthropology that I taught to a group of old ladies in Minneapolis. So I had no time to think about publishing the thesis for over a year. In late 1981, Guneman suggested I write to Marilyn Strathern at Cambridge to see if she might be interested in reading my thesis. I'd met her in Moresby, and he knew her very well from Cambridge at the same time. I knew that she was familiar with how Ophis worked too, as she had been at the ANU the same time as he was. So she agreed to look at it very generously, and so I sent it along. Meanwhile, the 1981 meeting of the AAA met, and I went there and met with the editor of Cambridge University Press. I mentioned that Strathern was looking at it. The editor invited me to submit my manuscript, which I did. In February, a couple months later, Marilyn supplied very numerous complimentary comments comparing North Mekeo with Hagen in the highlands of New Guinea, where she had studied. I could not have imagined that the most personally influential scholarly relationship of my career was then being forged. In June '83, Cambridge accepted my manuscript for publication. It was eventually published in 1985. I must stress, though, that practically everything I've written since then has spun out of ideas first formulated in that book, Quadripartite Structures. So as I continue, bear that in mind. My first journal article, Conception, Deconception, and Social Organization in Mekeo Culture, appeared in 1983. I wrote it while Quadripartite Structures was being reviewed. I rewrote it, I should say, the introduction and conclusion. It basically summarized the key arguments in the book. I eventually learned that Fred Damon and Deborah Battaglia, working in different parts of PNG close to the Trobrians, were reaching similar conclusions. Well, my concept of North Mekeo deconception came to epitomize for some investigators Marilyn Strathern's exegesis of Melanesian partible personhood in gender, in her book, Gender of the Gift, which I'll be discussing later. Up to the time of writing the thesis and book, Lévi-Strauss's myth formula had not attracted a lot of attention, though, at least in English-speaking anthropology. He himself had referred to it only sparingly in the 2,000 or so pages of his mythology masterpiece. Quadripartite Structures was receiving mostly positive reviews, but hardly no one commented on my use of the formula. And that was the main point. Thus, I drafted a follow-up essay, The Structural Study of Non-Myth, where one critic of Lévi-Strauss had surmised that most anthropologists simply pretended the formula did not exist. I wrote that I would pretend that it did. It was one of the greatest satisfactions of my career to see that little article awakened disciplinary interest in Lévi-Strauss's formula that continues to this day, particularly in France, of course. So quadripartite structures afforded me a first opportunity as well to pursue in print my long-standing interest in the Trobrians. Mekeo and Trobrians are closely related, politically and culturally, more so than most Melanesians appreciate. Melanesianists, too. They're more similar, in fact, than many other societies of the Kula ring are to the Trobrians. Even more obvious differences can be seen as clear structural transformations of one another, and that is why Malinowski's writings had so often served as backdrops to what I was learning and thinking about during fieldwork and thesis writing. Not only are there 4 clans, numerous other contexts of the culture are also quadripartite. So I devoted a chapter of my book to demonstrating just that. On the evidence that I had from other publications, I ventured that quadripartition was probably characteristic of other oceanic cultures. And later, as you will hear, I eventually undertook extended fieldwork in the Trobes myself. I mentioned earlier that I walked into a demanding undergraduate teaching job at Hartwick on finishing my doctorate in 1980. Actually, I was extremely lucky in getting any kind of job at all at that time. In those days, there were very few jobs available in anthropology for unpublished PhDs, especially white Anglo-Saxon males like myself. Quite miraculously, I got the appointment at Hartwick and joined a combined sociology anthropology department. It was comprised of 6 sociologists, 1 archaeologist, 1 biological anthropologist, and myself, the sole cultural anthropologist. I was responsible for teaching the entire suite of cultural anthro courses for 11 of the next 13 years. Teaching and additional responsibilities impinged on my ability to publish much beyond quadripartite structures, at least for a while. Upon arrival, I was pressured by my 2 anthropology colleagues to help them in seeking to establish as a separate department from sociology. The sociologists were resistant. In time, it was left to me to spearhead the campaign. Those 2 guys left, other 2 people came. So it took 6 years to grow our enrollment sufficiently for the administration to acquiesce, and I was appointed HOD. Nonetheless, I did find times to publish a few things. In 1957, Meyer Fortis, a giant in anthropology in Britain, had written a signature treatment on social reproduction. It was called The Developmental Cycle of Domestic Groups. He demonstrated how nuclear families in most societies underwent countervailing temporal processes of first expanding, then contracting to the point eventually disappearing. People are born, then they die. This supposedly was very different to unilineal descent groups, such as clans and lineages, which theoretically never died. Their members died, but they continued in perpetuity. Based on my model of North Mekeo deconception, my 1989 article, The Development Cycle of Public Groups, demonstrated how clans and lineages can undergo analogous processes. First through exogamous intermarriage, then through mortuary rites, which separated those ties between clans, enabling descendants to remarry. So that was one. In a 1992 essay, Clowning with Food, I described how laborers' humorous stage rituals of greedily engorging with food during mortuary death feasts performed a serious social function, again, that of deconception. By clowning around with food, grieving relatives of the deceased were able to laugh and overcome their sorrows, so they and their clans could return to ordinary profane life. So, on the basis of those articles, maybe, and quadripartite structured, I eventually received an invitation in 1987 from Maurice Godelier and Marilyn Strathern to join a symposium in Paris, investigating the 2 types of egalitarian leadership in Melanesia, one hereditary, the other non-hereditary. The Melpa people studied by Strathern epitomized non-hereditary big manship found throughout the region. Godelier, though, had recently discovered a hereditary mode of egalitarian leadership among the Baruya people, which he called great men. In my contribution to the symposium and in the chapter to the eventual volume, Great Men in Total Systems, title of my paper, I showed that the third major type of oceanic leadership found among non-egalitarian North Mekeo and many other Austronesian systems combined elements of both big men and great men. So on that basis, I argued that the heritable versus non-heritable distinction was potentially misleading to its reliance on exogenous, that is, Western analytic categories. Now, in the 1980s, social anthropology underwent a major shift towards history and social change. It's actually led largely by Marshall Solins and his structural history treatment of early post-contact transformations of Polynesian chiefdoms. Solins focused on the interplay between local people's pre-existing culture and the novel artifacts and ideas European colonial agents introduced. The indigenous modes of what he called divine chieftainship among Fijians, Hawaiians, and New Zealand Maori supplied the critical dynamic to his theories. So in the early 1990s, I wrote a pair of essays attempting to illustrate an additional source of change internal to non-divine big man societies and leadership. For that, I used the famous Yali cargo movement of post-World War II PNG as my example. One of those articles was called Yali Revisited. The other was Solins Among the Melanesians. In both, I outlined how, in an environment of intensely competing cargo leaders, historical events followed a consistent circular pattern. The pronouncement of new messages by the prophets led to the implementation of new activities or missions. Inevitably, they encountered political opposition. Those missions called for the pronouncement of new messages, leading to new missions, and so on. Those were the first of several engagements I've had with Solins' stimulating work, and I shall be addressing a few others. For my introductory social anthropology course at Hartwick, I worked up a series of lectures using structuralism to interpret the culture of the Mbuti hunter-gatherers of Central Africa. They've been charmingly described by Colin Turnbull in his bestseller, The Forest People. Now, the Mbuti have long been known popularly in the West as the Pygmies of Africa. For decades, his little book has been the most widely used study of a single culture in entry-level courses across America. Now, most studies of foraging peoples back then focused on the material and ecological adaptations of their cultures. That's assuming they shed light on the evolution of human societies much earlier. Read carefully, though, Turnbull described numerous ways that the Mbuti conceived of the Ituri forest, their home, as their father and mother, their god. But he never called attention to the circular pattern by which Mbuti cosmology, social structure, subsistence, and ritual life conform to each other in circles. So my 1987 The Symbols of Forest, published in American Anthropologist, attempted to demonstrate just that. Now, around 2015 or so, I stumbled upon a list compiled by the AAA from all of its journals of their ranking of the 200 most highly, frequently downloaded papers. My little Mbuti paper was number 171 or thereabouts. Marshall Solins' original affluent society was number 1. Of course, I knew at the time that most of those downloads, almost all of them probably, came from undergraduates who were looking for help writing papers that they would submit in their courses as original analyses of Mbuti culture and so on. So that was a little bit humbling, but still, I couldn't have been more pleased. Anyhow, thank you very much and hope to see you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.